Good evening, everyone. My name is Fred Birkbeck, and I'm presenting tonight's talk from the Kent Archaeological Society. Thanks to everyone for joining for this, and hope you enjoy it. The Kent Archaeological Society have been running quite a few of these talks. We have trustee talks and some guest presenters. Tonight we've got Andy Margetts presenting on his subject, which is the wandering herd, which is the medieval cattle economy of southeast England. And I hope you enjoy it. You can support the KAS by joining, and you can support us by following our Facebook page and following us on social media and interacting with us on social media as well. All these talks are being recorded and they're available shortly afterwards on our YouTube channel. And if you need to contact anyone at the KAS about our communications, about the bulletins that have been produced recently, about the magazines, or about any of the communications that we have with the members of the society and beyond, then you can contact me, and you can do so at communications@kentarchaeology.org.uk. Now, Andy has very kindly given his time up tonight to talk to us, and he's completed his PhD in medieval pastoralism at the University of Exeter in 2020. He currently works as a post-excavation manager at Archaeology South East, which is the Institute of Archaeology at UCL. He's written several articles and 2 books on medieval archaeology, and Andy has excavated widely in Kent, including medieval farmstead sites on the Isle of Sheppey, at the medieval hospital St Mary's in Ospringe, and the Roman Vicar settlement at Richborough. So we're delighted that Andy could join us tonight, and it's a really interesting topic that he's going to be talking on, something I know very little about. So I'll, without further ado, pass you over to Andy Margetts, and welcome, Andy.
Well, thanks very much, Fred, and good evening, everybody. My aim today is to introduce some of the key findings of a new book entitled The Wandering Herd. I want to challenge ingrained perceptions regarding the nature of pastoralism within southeast England over the long durée of the medieval period. I also want to show the importance of cattle within the evolution of the area's society, settlement and landscape. As a driver of colonisation and as a facilitator of both seasonal and permanent exploitation of so-called marginal areas, cattle husbandry played a central role in the evolution of Kent's historic landscape. The work involved a multidisciplinary study of the cattle economy during the Middle Ages. It examined aspects of the historic landscape, such as place names and medieval roads, as well as documentary evidence and archaeological remains. The study area really needs no introduction and comprised the modern counties of Kent, Surrey and East and West Sussex. It is an area of reasonably varied topography, with semi-upland landscapes encompassing the broad sweep of the North and South Downs, as well as the central High Weald. Variations in geology and topography, as well as cultural and economic factors, has led to the definition of a number of character areas, or PAEI. These zones transcend arbitrary administrative boundaries and have provided a real framework for the study of the South East historic landscape. To briefly summarise these PAEI, which together make up the region, we begin with the central core of the predominantly sandstone High Weald. This is surrounded by the heavily wooded clay vale of the Low Weald, which in turn is encompassed by the poor sandy soils of the Green Sand Ridge. These areas lie between the opposing chalk escarpments of the North and South Downs. To the east, we have the coastal reclaimed wetlands of Romney Marsh and the Pevensey Levels, and in the south, the rich arable area of the Sussex coastal plain. Astride the Upper Thames, we have the London or Thames Basin, and then further down the river, the diverse landscape of the North Kent Plain and Thames Estuary. So what are our current perceptions of the medieval pastoral economy in this part of England? Chances are the first thing that will spring to mind is the pasturing of sheep on the dry chalk hills, or perhaps even on the coastal wetlands of Romney Marsh or the Pevensey Levels. Or is it the seasonal pannage of pigs in the famous swine dens of the Kentish Weald and parts of Sussex? An aspect that might not be so apparent is the pasturing of cattle. But as I hope to show, these animals have played a fundamental role in the shaping of the region. Their influence extends throughout the medieval period and beyond. Prior to my new study, the only areas to receive any in-depth investigation of large-scale medieval cattle husbandry have been Dartmoor and parts of northern England. Areas of Blackburnshire, Lancashire and Cumbria have been shown by Angus Winchester to be associated with great specialised cattle ranches known as vacaries. These establishments have been seen as a fundamental part of medieval land use and settlement evolution, particularly in areas designated forest or chase. Vacaries were comprised of leased pasture, performing a number of functions. They sometimes acted as dairies, producing milk, butter and cheese, or as breeders of draft oxen, necessary for arable agriculture. They also comprised ranches producing fat stock, necessary to feed a burgeoning urban population. Vacaries possessed an enclosed plot of wood and meadow, as well as an expanse of open grazing. They included stock funnels and driftways, allowing livestock to move between the site and areas of rough pasture. Vacary enclosures included several dwellings and farm buildings clustered together. These comprised a dwelling for the cowkeeper and his family, the cow house, and possibly a house for hay and calves. Where they have been recorded, the great lay and ecclesiastical vacaries are often surrounded by large banks and ditches, or in stone using areas, vacary walls. The slide shows an example of the vacary walling near Wycoller in Chawden Forest, Lancashire. Wycoller comes from the Old English wick and alla, meaning dairy farm amongst the alder trees. Vacaries were key elements in the articulation of the landscape, often being placed on the slopes of well-watered riding land so that they could exploit open upland pasture. Although their occurrence has mainly been noted in wild northern uplands rather than the lowlands of southern England, documentary evidence for these establishments does exist. Vacaries are recorded from southern England since at least the time of Domesday. This entry for Sparshall in the Vale of the White Horse tells us of a dairy, a vacaria, which produced 6 ways of cheese. At Buckland, Bishop Osborne had a dairy, a wicker, producing 10 ways of cheese. In the southeast, there are tantalising indications that vacary establishments, or their equivalent, existed a long time prior to the conquest. Here I want to introduce the Surrey example of Calshot Manor. Calshot is located in an area of extensive heathland, and historic mapping showed it to be surrounded by an oval or arc-shaped enclosure separating it from the open heath beyond. Now you have to forgive my pronunciation of Old English. Calshot is named Cushitshagen in a 7th century charter. The name element Hagen or Hagen means an enclosure, and it's part of a number of related words pertaining to enclosures, fences and hedges. Calshot Manor, it seems, comprised an enclosure in a landscape of well-watered open pasture, for it's connected with the nearby cattle name of Cow Moor. This is mentioned in the same 7th century charter. To turn to Kentish examples, Archbishop Walfrid's high payment for a tract of marshland between Faversham Creek and Graveney, known as the King's Cowland, may be indicative of cattle dairies in a wetland context. The payment is recorded in an early 9th century Anglo-Saxon charter, which also refers to the purchase of an estate that included land known in Latin as Campus Armentorum and in English as Hariva Lee. River is the Old English for cattle, and these records show that cattle pasturing may have been more important in the early medieval southeast than is immediately obvious, and that there was a Kentish royal interest in the pasturing of cows. One of the key characteristics of a vacary site is an oval enclosure. When a certain number of criteria come together, it's possible to actually discern vacary sites. Here we have the example of Chelwood Vetchery on Ashdown Forest in Sussex, a vacary that was owned by the Augustinian monks of Mickland Priory and featured an oval enclosure and a vacary place name. At the Vacary on the Surrey-Sussex border, a medieval cattle enterprise was again characterised by an oval enclosure, that was later converted into a hunting park for deer. Again, it is associated with a vacary name, but other place name indicators of cattle establishments also exist, such as wick, stool and stock, elements that we'll return to later. A report of inquisition within the Canterbury Cathedral archives explicitly mentions the presence of a Kentish vacary. Here we can see that the tenants of the Hundred of Marden should repair the house of a cow pasture, a vacaria, called Cow House in the manner of Milton Regis. The tenants of Marden should repair the park called Summer House and should make cheese, butter and dairy products for the sergeant called Leday. Along with oval enclosures and access to open pasture, the possession of a cow house is one of the key defining features of a vacary site. They are often substantial affairs. Here we can see that just part of the cow house at Milton Regis measured 18 feet in width and was 48 feet long. So vacaries are clearly traceable through documentary and toponymic evidence, as well as the particular landscape forms they took and the buildings they possessed. But where might we expect vacaries to be located? The study explored the available medieval animal bone assemblages from the different palae of the southeast. This included some of the largest and most up-to-date bone assemblages from the region. Analysis was undertaken in relation to site status and time frame. The assemblages were also compared to national data for the three major domesticates, that is pigs, sheep or goats, and cattle. So what did we find out? Sheep or cattle dominated the regional livestock economies to greater or lesser extents. Data was explored throughout the medieval period, but here I'd just like to focus on the results for the 8th to the earlier 14th century. This was a time characterised by the developed market economy and a suite of agrarian changes brought about by the so-called long 8th century. From the examination of the animal bone assemblages, it's possible to suggest that cattle were an important livestock species throughout the southeast, but particularly so in certain landscapes. The slide gives us a reasonably accurate picture of where cattle, as opposed to sheep country, lay. These divergences are inextricably linked to underlying environmental factors, which, despite not dictating the keeping of certain livestock types, nonetheless influenced medieval husbandry choices. In Kent, Romney Marsh and parts of the North Kent Plain were exploited for their suitability for sheep, while the soils and hydrology of the High Weald encouraged the keeping of cattle. The dry light soils of the North Downs were extensively used for the pasturing of sheep, whilst the well-watered, heavy clay lands of the Low Weald were considered cattle country. What this figure serves to emphasise is how important cattle were in terms of the geographical area covered. It is the core area of the Weald and those lands that bordered the Thames Valley where cattle were favoured. Sheep dominated a smaller landmass, although these areas have been historically considered to be amongst the most densely settled and economically advanced within the region. So it is the area of the Weald and parts of the North Kent Plain where we can expect to find cattle establishments. Certainly the marshes and creeks on the border of the Swale have been previously mentioned as cattle pasture. The medieval agricultural writer Walter of Henley tells us of the value that marshland pasture held for the grazing of cattle. He stated that 2 cows fed on salt marsh would yield the same, a whey of cheese and half a gallon of butter, as 3 cows fed on wood pasture, stubbles or meadow after it had been cut. But woodland, and in particular wood pasture, was one of the most abundant grazing resources available to medieval husbandmen. The role of wood pasture and the rights and customs attached to it were a fundamental influence to the evolution of settlement in Kent and the wider southeast. Although pastoral exploitation of the woodland resource is often investigated through the pannage of swine, wood pasture for cattle also played an important role in the early agrarian economy. Tracing this economy using solely documentary evidence is, however, extremely difficult. Nevertheless, woodland cattle pasture is mentioned in a number of pre-conquest documents. In AD 805, Cuthred, King of Kent, granted Hrytherley, or the cattle glades near Peckham in the Buckholt Forest, to the Archbishop of Canterbury. And in AD 724, Minster was granted a right to pasture in Blean, Buckholt and Oxney, the ox enclosure. These examples are a rarity, and the importance of wood pasture for cattle has usually relied on other forms of evidence, such as place names, rather than purely documentary investigation. Alan Everett has viewed Downland names incorporating stall and steel as being indicative, although not exclusively so, of woodland vaccaries. These cattle pastures may have been characteristic of the downland economy before and for a time after the conquest. Everett cited a number of places, including Stallisfield above Charing, Mystall in Charlton, Dunstall in Shoreham and Dunstall in Lenham, as certain cattle establishments or dairy farms. His inclusion of Tunstall near Milton in this group of names can be commended in the light of the documentary evidence associated with the manor of Milton Regis explored previously, and the fact that Tunstall names have been seen by Angus Winchester in the north of England as being used to specifically denote vacary sites. The correspondence of stall and steel names with vacaries may not always be straightforward, as other meanings such as homestall are also possible. This confusion is compounded by the prevalence of minor settlements known as forestalls in Kent and East Sussex. Within Kent, forestall is virtually confined to the pastoral areas of the county, particularly to the Weald and the Downs. While it may have latterly taken on the connotation of a farm green, it seems to have originally indicated a stall or standing place in front of a farmhouse, possibly one where cows were brought to be milked. Beer forestall in Elham was taken by Everett to mean either a pasture forestall or a stall in front of a byre or cattle shed. Likewise, he took Mersham forestall in an area of riverine pasture to denote a subordinate dairy farm. During excavations at the Hayworth in West Sussex, we found evidence of a stall in front of the substantial cowhouse. To turn to stock names, such places may have been equivalent to the seasonal shearings of the north and west of Britain. For in the southern English context, low-lying, well-watered standing places for cattle were termed in the early medieval period stock. These were used by herdsmen during the summer who drove their cattle from a parent vill. Often, therefore, the pastures came to be named as the stock of a particular original settlement, as in Cowstock in Cornwall as the stock of Callington, Plymstock in Devon as the stock of Plympton, and Basingstoke in Hampshire as the stock of Basing. It is likely that such stock names originated as parts of wider estates, and only later would they become outlying dairy or cattle farms. The stocks of Sussex and Surrey seem to be of early derivation, as the majority are of clear pre-conquest origin. Of the Kentish stocks, the most prominent group is to be found in the area near Milton Regis. These include Woodstock, Pitstock, Bistock, Pistock and Stockbury. Milton Regis has access to the rich marshland pasture of North Kent, and it seems that wetland pastures were also related to the stocks of Surrey and Sussex. So, armed with our corpus of information about medieval vaccaries, can we actually trace the vacary of Milton Regis on the ground? By examining the OS First Edition map, we can begin to populate the area around Milton Regis with likely vacary elements. So we have the Royal Head settlement of Milton Regis itself. This is located near to a creek that feeds into the Swale. Prior to reclamation, this creek would have been surrounded by open marshland pasture. And these pastures are sandwiched between the Swale and the North Downs. Articulating these landscapes together are a number of northeast to southwest orientated droveways. It's possible to discern two oval enclosures, Straddling the dip slope of the Downs and the North Kent Plain is the probable traces of the main vacary enclosure at Tunstall. To the west is a detached woodland enclosure. We have our stock place names, locations that probably represent outlying dairy farms, and Milstead, our milking place. The vacary at Tunstall clearly exploited the marshes around the Swale for its summer grazing, the environment facilitating the high milk yields, allowing the making of cow's cheese and butter. The woodlands of the North Downs would have been exploited during those periods of the year when the marshes were flooded, and although the grazing was not as rich here as on the marshes, it was abundant and cheap. At this period, cattle dairies were extravagant affairs. The ewe and the she-goat were the more common dairy animal. Though unimproved medieval stock is likely to have been able to make better use of rough pasture and browse than modern cattle breeds, dairies would have still required large quantities of hay to see herds through the winter. At Doomsday, it was the Kentish river valleys and the area to the north of Romney Marsh where the largest acreage of meadow could be found. Nevertheless, woodland resources, and in particular pollard or tree hay, could provide alternative feed when other fodder was scarce. Branches from trees in leaf were cut in the peak of the growing season and stored for winter feed. The branches were typically harvested during the late summer. As a ruminant, cows are able to extract more nutrition from lesser quality fodder, and beech, ash, elm, holly and ivy were all cut to feed cattle over the winter months. Despite its importance to the dairy economy, grass does not always constitute the preferred food of cattle. Browse and coarse weeds can make up a significant part of the animal's diet, something capitalised on the Woodland farmer by the grazing of hedges and shores. On average, modern cattle breeds pastured in woodland can consume between approximately 6 kilograms and 8 kilograms of foraged browse per day, and it's probable that unimproved medieval stock could make even more use of this poor quality feed. Indeed, my research shows that woodland pasture for cattle played a much more prominent role in the early agrarian economy of the southeast than we once supposed. Cattle were an important feature of the woodland economy of Kent and those regions of the southeast that experienced so-called secondary settlement. Nevertheless, both pigs and cattle required careful management in order to benefit from their various advantages and so as not to disrupt the sensitive ecology of the forest. Cattle were pastured in coppice woodland once the stalls had grown above browsing height, and pigs were turned out in the autumn to feed on mast. The value of coppice depended on the management cycle, but generally it improved grazing by opening up the canopy, providing space and light to the woodland floor. But cattle were destructive to new growth and would be confined to plots of around 5 to 7 years old. Pig grazing could be beneficial prior to stocking in woodlands by clearing up the autumn acorn crop, which if consumed in quantity by cows can cause birth defects and even death. Environmental evidence from Hayworth in Sussex has shown that oak may have been deliberately reduced by the combined feeding of pigs and cattle, as well as careful selection by people. This alternate grazing of cattle and pigs was valuable in other ways too, as it assisted woodland regeneration. This was achieved in 3 ways. First, by the planting and encouragement of mast-bearing trees. Secondly, by the loosening of the soil through the rooting activities of swine, which creates ideal germination conditions for saplings. And thirdly, by the trampling of cattle, which can help reduce bracken cover. The destination of the early medieval pig herder was the Anglo-Saxon den, so commonly and simplistically interpreted as a pasture for swine, where the den place names were sometimes prefixed with cattle elements, cautiously indicating that seasonal pasturing of cattle may have been an equally important function of the den's early use. By the time of Doomsday, the large swine renders recorded for Otford and Rotherham in Kent and South Malling in Sussex imply tenants' herds of 1,500 to 2,000 swine. Such large numbers would have been further swelled by the pigs of the domain. The difficulties of herding pigs the conflation of pannage with transhumance, and a distance between some outlying pastures and their parent settlements has led to a questioning of our understanding of the element den and how valid use of seasonal wood pastures for swine really was. Some authorities have played down the national importance of pannage as a method of livestock production. Oliver Rackham, for instance, has stated how the customs were often jocular, fanciful, or even deliberately prohibitive, and that to breed animals with the aim of utilising such an unpredictable resource as the mast crop was completely impractical. I am in no way arguing that the seasonal pannage of swine was not of great importance in Kent, but merely that it has sometimes overshadowed the rest of the woodland pastoral economy. My research shows that the Woodland pannage season was preceded by a period of cattle summering. The fact that Woodland place names such as Milkstead, Somerden and Somerlees have been linked to a phase of early medieval dairying strengthen the case for the yearly movement of cattle. The value placed on these seasonal sites is testified by the distance covered in the annual journey to the commons. As the medieval period progressed, however, swine may have gradually decreased in prominence as cattle's importance grew. As larger swathes of the Weald were turned over to settled agriculture and increased deserting ate into the old remnants of the forest, the seasonal movement of swine went into decline. It can be postulated too that the summering of cattle would have been curtailed, although the species had by this time become essential to the settled Woodland farmer. On sufficiently documented estates, the method of production adopted by these pioneers was a form of convertible husbandry, or infield-outfield. A relatively small acreage near the main barns was generously manured and almost permanently cropped with a mixture of either wheat, oats, or leguminous crops such as beans. Cattle to the Woodland farmer had become what sheep were to the downsman, a walking source of manure that facilitated an arable crop. Not only that, but prior to mechanisation, the Sussex ox was the only beast capable of ploughing the intractable Woodland clays. So I hope I've convinced you that cattle were a far more important livestock type in medieval Kent than the previous studies focused on sheep and swine would have us realise. I hope I've repopulated the medieval woods of your imagination with the lowing of cattle. But the relevance of this study does not stop in the past. How we shape our prospective environment can be informed by bygone practice, as well as through engagement with livestock and landscapes long since vanished. Woodlands are increasingly becoming targets for restoration, and understanding of cattle's place in wood pasture management can surely aid conservation grazing. There are a number of conservation reasons for keeping cattle in woodlands. These include the benefits to biodiversity by reducing tree and scrub regeneration, maintaining open habitats, and by decreasing dominant plant species. Conservation managers who wish to encourage a range of ancient and semi-natural woodland types have encouraged lower stocking densities, usually a stocking around 0.5 livestock units per hectare. Something that was clearly managed by medieval farmers by way of stints, small herd sizes, and restrictions on the month and length of grazing. For restoration of lowland wood pasture and maintenance of parkland environments, a higher grazing intensity is usually recommended. The grazing of enclosed spaces was a particular feature of the medieval period within the southeast, and it is important to consider the varying environments that would have existed within ring-fenced areas, including seasonally grazed dens and the more heavily cropped vaccaries and deer parks of the early and later medieval periods. Traditional breeds hold value in their ability to make use of lower quality feed. Personally, in an uncertain world, I see such traits as valuable, and they need not be a barrier to production and profit. I wonder whether any of you attended the fantastic CBA Southeast and SAS conference on climate change last weekend. One of the traits of the Sussex breed of cattle is that it's purported to have twice as many sweat glands as other European breeds, and is capable of adjusting to hot weather. This has meant it was exported to South America, Australia and South Africa, where its ability to cope with high temperatures was valued. Our ability to learn from the livestock of the past has therefore great potential in helping us respond to climate change and other trials of the future. Well, I hope this brief overview has given you some idea about the research contained within my new book. Cattle's importance to Kent has been underappreciated historically, something that archaeology as well as historical sources can help to illustrate. Thanks very much.
That was fascinating. It is, as I said before, something I don't know too much about. It's interesting that what we are looking at now in terms of our ecology, introducing breeds that have gone out of common use or common population into our village. And one of the things you mentioned about the home stalls you mentioned, of course, by Blaine, where I've done some research there on the archaeology of that area, and they've introduced bison into the fields around there. Could you explain why you think that might be important in terms of introducing other breeds?
Bison aren't necessarily, I mean, they're a very unique species. European bison, their habitat is you know, the sort of primordial forest of Eastern Europe primarily. And what I'm really interested in is I mean, the Blean is a product of medieval wood pasture. That's the inheritance, its inheritance in the landscape today. And that is perhaps more tangible to me than a Bronze Age or pre-Bronze Age environment which would have contained bison. That's not to say I don't understand enough about bison's impact on some of maybe the dominant plant species which they might be trying to control in the Blean. I believe that maybe they may be trying to open up the habitat, which I hear bison are quite good at. I mean, they're quite different to domesticated cattle. But certainly I think that they're also pasturing cattle within the Blean, and I'd be interested to see the impact of cattle there as well, on opening up the woodland, reducing some of the bracken cover maybe. But I think in terms of modern cattle breeds, they're quite far removed from what we had in the medieval period. There weren't breeds as such in the medieval period. There was a huge diversity in cattle, all different shapes and sizes, polled and unpolled, you know, with horns and without horns, different colours. But there may have been regional genetic regionalisation. You know, black cattle in Wales, or the Sussex cattle, brown cattle in the southeast. That may have become more prevalent over time, and then as breeds which are really a post-medieval invention start to be, you know, part of the agricultural revolution. Right. That's really when breeds come about. But that's not to say that this genetic legacy, regional genetic legacy of cattle, wasn't there for the medieval period. But yeah, I'll be really interested to see how the European bison do in the Blean. I am interested in it, but as I say, my focus is really domesticated stock and the stock of the medieval period rather than the pre-medieval period, which we might associate with the European bison. Okay.
Yeah, I'm probably as guilty as anybody else about, you know, when I consider about pastoralism in the medieval times, I think about sheep and swine particularly. And when we think of the trackways and the hollowways that we know very well that have been created, I always think of them driving pigs to market, driving pigs between pastures, that kind of thing. So we've got a lot more to thank the cattle herders for then, by the sounds of it.
Yeah, I think so. And that's not to say that, you know, the droveways weren't utilised for the movement of pigs. They almost certainly were. But I think that some of the morphology of the droveways hints that maybe cattle were part of that movement. We have greens and stopping places that possibly wouldn't necessarily be with good watering sites, possibly wouldn't be required by pigs. Some of the fantastic work that Martin Bell's been doing on the droveways shows that really they are of quite, you know, some antiquity. I think that maybe the more scientific work that we can do on dating some of these routeways is really going to be beneficial for our understanding of just how many other livestock species and how over what a great time frame these routeways may have evolved. Certainly, to my mind, the movement of cattle helps to produce that hollow way by erosive effects. As soon as the ground is disturbed enough that water can get in and start really eroding, channeling gullies through these. On the downland, that's quite clear. You know, if you walk up a Borstal onto the North Downs or the South Downs, you see those erosion gullies. I think that cattle would have been quite important, the movement of cattle, to really kick off that process. Maybe more so than pigs, although, you know, pigs root as they move. You know, I think that they would be chivied along a bit more than cattle, and it's the hoofs of cattle that I think maybe kick off that erosive process and have really been key to the formation of some of the hollowways and droveways within the southeast.
So just talking on a more general point, Andy, because we got a lot of student members. We've got free student membership for this year, completely free if you're a registered student anywhere in the world and you want to join the Kent Archaeological Society, receive your members' publications and access to all the events and communications from myself and other people at the society. One of the things that we've been trying to encourage people like yourself to do is to inspire some of those people to think about different ways of approaching heritage. So what particularly got you interested in this subject?
I've always been interested in agriculture and I've always been interested in ecology. I came into the world of archaeology, but I still had those underlying interests. I excavated near Haywards Heath and I encountered a vacary site. So that really kicked off my interest in the cattle economy. And the more I researched it, the deeper I saw it going, and maybe that it'd been a sort of forgotten aspects of the southeast past. But kind of my recommendation for anyone who's interested in archaeology is look to some of your other interests as well, and maybe bring that into your archaeology sphere, and that can really kind of kick on your interest and your research into specific elements of archaeology and the history of, for me, our historic landscape, but other people have, you know, diverse interests, and I think really embrace them and try and find what interests you, find what you're passionate about. And there's such a diverse field, archaeology. You can find so many interests within it. And I would really encourage other students to get involved with local societies. I mean, there's a huge fountain of knowledge out there. Members of societies, the excellent journals that are produced by societies. It's a real resource for students, I think. But primarily, my real message would be use what you're interested in alongside archaeology and really kind of embrace your interests.
Yeah, that's good advice. If you study something you like, the chances are you'll end up doing a job with something you like, and then it won't feel like a job. That's the idea, anyway.
That's right. Yeah.
So then, just on a professional level, from an archaeologist perspective, the generally when we find animal remains on site, you make a note of it. You sort of the species, if you can identify it yourself, and then it goes off to post excavation. But it sounds like there's a lot more to it when it gets to your desk. It's not just kind of recording what there is. It's thinking about it and applying it to your own reflections on the past and the importance of what's been kept where and how much of it has been kept there, that kind of thing. Is that something that in your professional life that you're sort of allowed to indulge yourself in your interest particularly, and how does that fit in with the research aims?
Well, my employer, Archaeology Southeast and UCL, I mean, they've been massively encouraging over my career, for me to develop my career, support through my PhD, in giving me time to attend supervisory meetings and things like that. I did it part-time when I was still working full-time. I did over 6 years of part-time study, and my amazing supervisor, Professor Stephen Rippon, was a real sort of inspiration for me. But in terms of my day-to-day work, I think it's always just seeing those avenues, just finding out what you're interested in, and pursuing that. There'll always be an angle that you can pursue in your work, and yeah, I've been massively encouraged to do that by my employer, who've just been absolutely fantastic. So yeah, I've been very lucky, really. Lot of work outside of my day job, but by doing field work, decade plus in the field, really doing my sort of groundwork there, but then finding avenues that I was interested in and then taking that on to a research level.
Oh, right. We've got a few comments coming in, so if you don't mind, Andy, I'd like to just read some of those out to you. We have a message from Jane. She says she hadn't really thought about this before because she's worked on an early 14th century food account from Tunbridge Priory. Right. And a lot of cows and beef were being brought from stock at Yalding and Tunbridge. And having envisaged open fields up to now, can she presume that these cows were being kept alongside the pigs in woodland area around this part of the Weald?
I think certainly in the early medieval period in the Weald, things start to change as you move later through the medieval period. But I think that a period of cattle summering would have preceded the autumn pannage season. So there's almost some kind of symbiosis between the swine pannage. We go in and clear up the acorn crop, which is, as I explained in my talk, is quite detrimental to the pasturing of cows. Acorns are poisonous to cows. And that's still practiced in the New Forest today. The swine will clear up the acorn crop, and so you can then pasture cows and ponies on the heathland there. But yeah, in the early medieval period, I think certainly cattle were pastured in the Weald during the summer up till the autumn, and then maybe pigs took over.
Okay, so it would have cleared the acorns. So is that why we haven't got the pata negra like the Spanish have their acorn-fed pork? They're very famous, and we end up clearing it away so the cows can get in there and do some forestry for us.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we've really lost in our livestock economy in Britain. We had a Berwickshire ham, basically. It's you can still buy pannage pig You can still buy it in the New Forest, I believe, and I think there's places on the borders of Wales where you can still buy free-ranging woodland fed swine, but it's been lost. It would be fantastic if someone reintroduced it into the Weald. I think what a quality piece of produce that is, and that's really kind of my interest, is that some of these agricultural regimes of the past, I think, should be re-embraced. We're looking for we're looking at our landscape now. We're looking at climate change, impacts on wildlife. These old regimes, they worked well with the forest ecology. So why not re-embrace panaged swine in the Weald? There's still a huge amount of acorn and beech moss there. What a fantastic piece of produce that would be. I'm sure that people in top restaurants in London would be falling over themselves to get hold of Weald and ham,
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's we've got another question here from Gillian. You mentioned some of them in your talk, and she wants to know what documentary sources have you used in your research?
Huge variety, really. Everything from customals to Anglo-Saxon charters, manorial accounts. A huge diversity.
Okay. We've got many of the resources for tithes. We've got tithes and monumental inscriptions on our website that people can look at for free. We don't have that kind of level of detail. Then maybe we should speak to our honorary librarian about stocking up some more on those sources. Well, Andy, I want to thank you for coming online tonight to talk about your research, and hopefully it's inspired a few people to think about some different ways of approaching our heritage, and knowing that there are organisations and companies that will support your research. It must be quite refreshing for you to be able to follow something that you're very obviously extremely passionate about. As I said before, we do a series of these talks, and we're always very, very grateful when people give their time up to talk to our members and beyond on these events. Now, this is recorded. It's available on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, thanks for joining us, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you get updates on everything that comes up, and also put a thumbs up on us down the bottom as well. To any of our members who've had the latest magazine and the latest bulletin that's been distributed, there are some volunteering opportunities at the Kent Archaeological Society now that we're all opening up, and there'll be lots of mixed ability volunteering opportunities, and also mixed interest volunteering opportunities in the communications and media and website and everything else. I could always do with some extra help. So again, communications@kentarchaeology.org.uk if you want to get involved in that. There are lots of other opportunities as well for data gathering, data input, and all sorts of things like this. So Andy, I want to thank you again for coming tonight and speaking to us so eloquently and so interestingly on this subject, and for sticking around to answer my questions as well.
Well, thank you. It's a real privilege to talk to you all. It's great, and keep up the good work, Fred.
Thank you, and don't forget Andy's book, The Wandering Herd, will be available. Which is the publisher?
It's Windgather Press, which is an imprint of Oxbow Books.
Okay, right. So if you think that will help with your research, then please make sure you check it in your local library, or maybe you can get an article in Arch Cant for us for the next edition, Andy. That would be really nice. Okay, you're very welcome to. Okay, well, thanks everyone. Thank you ever so much for tuning in and for joining us on YouTube if you are. Have a great weekend, the rest of it, and join us for our next event, which will be another trustee talk and details of which will be on our website on kentarchaeology.co.uk/news/events. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you.